Chapter 3. Tag pulled the rental car into an empty space at the darkened lookout and settled back in his seat for a moment to enjoy the view of the valley below. Small batches of lights twinkled, outlining the small community of Little River and the nearby towns. This high on the mountain, he could see for 50 miles or more. He pushed open his door, grabbing the University of Wyoming ball cap on the passenger seat out of habit. It was nearing midnight. No one was likely to even be driving on the highway, let alone the small lane he'd taken to the lookout and the trailhead. So he didn't need to hide, but he shoved the cap on anyway. The fact that he always wore a ball cap was something he shared with both his personas. He started down the thin strip of dirt that led to the trailhead. The trail up the waterfall was an easy one, and with his flashlight it wouldn't be a dangerous nighttime hike. There were certainly others on this mountain that he'd taken before that would be, but he only had this one night in Little River before his tour bus moved on to other towns in Wyoming, ending in Casper. Then he'd take at least 6 months to rest while he worked on his new album. The hometown tour had been a brilliant idea, and he'd enjoyed being back in Wyoming and the neighboring states, not to mention the fact that they'd been hugely successful, and the talk about it had ended up selling out the 4 big city venues on the tour. He should have suspected that it didn't matter what he sang. It wouldn't change Roxy's mind, but he'd hoped, even though she'd ignored years' worth of concert tickets that he'd sent her in hopes that she'd just come and listen, for once hear what he was telling her. But she hadn't, so now he needed to take this hike anyway and clear his head of her once and for all. He would be okay. Over the years, he'd learned to let go of the hurt that came with another heartfelt song he'd written for her that she ignored. With every year that had passed, missing her had become a little easier. The hope eroded little by little that she would hear something in one of his songs to make her finally understand. And little by little, he'd been okay, even though he missed her like crazy. When Bo scheduled the kickoff in Little River, Tag had decided to take one last shot. Even when he walked out on stage and found her hand in hand with Nash Roberts, small towns, if she stayed here, he would probably know every single boyfriend she ever had by name. Tag Turner, how dare you? He froze at the entrance to the trail, a smile spreading over his face. The way she'd stood stiffly next to Nash and then fled the concert without so much as talking to him had sparked a hope that at least she cared. And the anger in her voice? He could work with that. For the first time in years, that spark inside him lit into a small flame. Maybe he could finally make her love him enough. He turned around, not bothering to wipe off the smirk. She was as gorgeous as ever, long brown hair pulled up on top of her head, wispy strands waving around her face as she walked toward him, arms swinging. How dare I, what, Rox, come back? Sing that song in front of everyone, say all that nonsense in front of the whole county and then some. She folded her arms and leaned toward him, the way she'd lectured him a dozen times or more in high school. Including Nash, he said dryly. Especially Nash, she snapped. Tag took a step toward her, knowing that his tough girl wouldn't give an inch, and if he'd flustered her enough to make her run away, this ought to crank things up a few levels. If Nash is such a big deal, what's the problem with me singing that song? She took a long breath in and then slowly let it out, shaking her head at him. You've never sang it before, and you suddenly decide to introduce it to the world the night you're back in Little River and top it off with a crazy publicity stunt? How would you know I'd never sang it? He tilted his head to the side, letting it go for now that she'd dismissed his pleas to love him. She'd never been to a concert that he knew of until tonight, and he'd like to hear her admit it right now. One long strand of her straight hair hung down almost to her shoulder, and a breeze shifted in front of her face. He wanted to reach up and push it aside, but Tag had known Roxy long enough to know that he had to let her anger simmer down before he stoked a different kind of flame. The internet is blowing up, every girl asking when the single will be released, and who is Roxy Adams, and why did she run away, and yet the Taggart Dubois camp has been strangely silent. Still, her jaw worked. The fact that her anger hadn't diminished in the last few minutes made Tag even more hopeful. Why would it matter so much if it didn't matter? Sure, he'd made plenty sure she knew exactly what he was asking and exactly how he felt. And that meant everyone in the world would know pretty soon as well. But if she didn't love him even a little, why was she so worked up about it? Why wasn't she ignoring him the way she had the past 8 years? He kept a casual expression and reached into his pocket for his phone. Sure enough, Bo had called several times and texted, asking Tag what was with the new song. Tag put the phone back in his pocket. Well, guess the decision's made about whether to put that on my new album if it's so popular. He shrugged. She cried in frustration and spun away from him. You are the worst, Tag. What's the big deal? He repeated, shifting so he sat on the fence lining either side of the trailhead. If you ever actually cared about that song, I expect you might have said something the last few years. Just like that, she was back in his face, finger waving. You don't get to do that. You don't get to waltz in and out of my life with sweet words like you always do and act like it's my fault I didn't follow you like the puppy you wanted. You don't get to blow through my life and scatter everything before you blow right back out like you always do. He stood back up, using the 6-inch height difference to his advantage, making her crane her neck and take a hurried step back when her flying hands brushed over his t-shirt. You don't get to come in here like I haven't been begging for your love since day one, like you always do, he finished in a tone matching hers. Ha! She folded her arms again and ducked her chin. You expect me to fall at your feet because you sang some sweet lyrics but never showed me any truth to them? I expected you to love me enough to understand when I said I love you. He flipped on his flashlight, spinning it toward the trail. Suddenly, her temper wasn't attractive or the beginning of a spark. It only reminded him of the first time she'd heard that song, when she'd said he wasn't enough. But he shed the disappointing ache. He had plenty of practice over the years pretending like Roxy casting him aside hadn't bothered him. Besides, it made for lots of mournful song material. Heading down to the waterfall, he said with a half smile that had made many a woman go weak in the knees, just not ever Roxy. You're welcome to come along. Then he turned his back on her and walked away. Roxy tossed and turned in the early morning hours, trying to banish memories of Tag from her mind and figure out why that man got under her skin so well. I'll never be enough for you no matter how famous I am, Tag had said when he stood at the door of her dorm room, hand on the door handle and ready to leave. His goodbye had rung heavy in the air, a weight pressing against Roxy's chest, making it difficult to breathe. That thread that always stretched between them pulled tight, begging her to ease the tension along the line, to go to him, stay by him, lest the thread snap. But she swallowed that temptation, even if it meant that he was saying once she followed Tag, that's all she'd ever do. She'd see the ranch, home, in fleeting glances over her shoulders, raise kids on a tour bus or in Nashville. She didn't want that life. You can't expect me to give up so much on so little, she'd said back, hanging onto her desk chair with one hand to keep her steady. His eyes narrowed, and he'd shaken his head. A second later, he'd stepped through the door. Girls in the common room outside gasped, and she heard someone whisper his name. Then the thread snapped. She pulled a pillow over her head. Whether or not she had feelings for Tag was a moot point. Nothing he'd said last night led her to believe he was looking for an early retirement and a nice, quiet life in their beautiful little hometown. Nothing he'd said made her believe any more that she had back then that he honestly loved her. She woke late the next morning and checked in with Bellamy before hopping in her truck and heading to town. When she got to the clinic, she parked in the back with the rest of the employees and slipped in the back door. How busy is Nash today? She asked one of the nurses manning the desk. Swamped, the brunette said with a pitying glance at Roxy. Roxy bristled. She'd already read enough nonsense online from the locals, and she wasn't particularly excited about experiencing it firsthand. But he's in his office right now, so I bet you could sneak a minute, the nurse went on. Thanks. Roxy forgave the nurse her pity and hurried down the hall to Nash's office, tapping a couple times before pushing the door open. I'm coming, Shelley. Just let me finish this one thing. Nash chewed on the end of a pen, one hand in his hair as he studied the paper in front of him. Roxy smiled as she admired him in the black scrubs he wore. His lab coat hung over the back of the chair, but more often than not he forgot to wear it anywhere. He must have gone back and forth between the hospital a few times today to already be out of his slacks and dress shirt. Can you spare 1 minute for this little thing? Roxy asked, shutting the door behind her. Nash's gaze snapped up and his customary smile flashed onto his face before it disappeared almost as fast. She rushed over before he got too far in his rememberings of the night before and sat on the edge of the desk. I'm really sorry about last night. I acted like an 18-year-old, maybe because somehow seeing Tag again brought me back there, and I didn't think. He upset me because that song used to mean something to me, but that's all in the past. Tag is gone, of course, and he's not coming back to Little River, she said hurriedly. Nash really only had a minute. She had to get this apology out as quickly as she could. He studied her intently as she spoke, then said his next words cautiously. Did you love him back then, when he came and asked you to come along? She hesitated over her words, cringing when Nash stiffened. Maybe, she admitted. It's hard to know what was hurt over him throwing away our friendship and what might have meant more. But that was a long time ago. He had to do something big when he came home. It's what people expect of Tag. It doesn't mean anything, not really to him, especially not to me. She tilted her head in a plea for Nash to understand. They'd been dating for 8 months, plenty of time to know each other, but in this quiet little town, they hadn't faced a disruption like Tag Turner before this. She wanted them to pass this test. I'm sorry for the way things went down last night. You're here, and that's right where I'm desperate to be. Nash stood, wrapping his arms around her waist. Thank you, Rox. I understand it threw you for a loop. I wish you would have told me how much you didn't want to go to that concert. Even though it was a gentle scold, Nash had a way of making an apologetic tone wind through the words. This man was an angel. He bent over her, pulling her closer to him as they kissed. She wound her arms around his back, relaxing now that their fight had settled quicker than she'd hoped. Yeah, she murmured against his lips. I should have said something. I didn't want to make it a big deal, but I see now I should have just been honest. Apology accepted. He smiled, continuing their kiss before he pulled away reluctantly. I really have to go. I'm still feeling a little sick over how I acted, she whispered, making Nash chuckle. I'd better investigate that very seriously. She laughed with him, enjoying their moment, however brief. Come over for dinner tonight? She asked as she finally leaned back away from him. Of course, it's been a wild day, so I don't know how late. He brushed his fingers over her jawline, dropping a kiss on her cheek before he stepped back toward the door. I'm sorry, hon. It's crazy. She stepped toward him, drawing him back to her for one more kiss. Thank you for the minute, and you've earned the right to be as late as you need to be. See you later. He opened the door and slipped out of the office. She followed him, her body relaxing by the second, the more that his presence, even for a moment, filled her. There was a steadiness to Nash that she'd recognized from those first dates, and it reeled her in every day. She could picture so easily a happy, settled life with him. Being a doctor brought with it its share of crazy, but he didn't make her guess about his feelings, and he didn't need grand gestures to show them. Maybe Tag Turner really did love her, and maybe he had written all those songs about her. The truth was, he never said it, and that meant something.